Hey everybody, it's Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. So it's been a while since we recorded any podcasts. I think the last episode released in June of Diplomatic Immunity, but we are ready to get back at it. We've got a new project here at Diplomatic Immunity. It's called Headlines in History. In each of these episodes, our Assistant Director of Programs and Research, Freddie Mallinson, and myself will discuss a few recent events in international affairs and bring in experts to provide some background into the most pressing topic of the day. Every week, we'll be alternating between this new format and our regular Diplomatic Community episodes, where we take listeners on a deep dive inside some of the biggest foreign policy challenges facing Washington and the world today. In our first episode, we'll be running you through the latest updates in the Liberian and Polish elections, updates from Russia not related to Ukraine, and finally, we'll get an update on the situation in Gaza from Georgetown expert Professor Dan Byman.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, everybody, welcome to our first episode of Headlines in History, and I'd like to introduce our newest member of ISD, Freddie Mallinson. Freddie, welcome to the show, welcome to ISD, and good morning.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning.
What do you got for us this week, Freddie?
So we are starting today with the Liberian elections. It is not a country often on the US's radar, but it just held the first round of its presidential election. George Weah, the incumbent former soccer star elected in 2018, is seeking a second term, but has faced widespread criticism for not delivering on promises to fight corruption and poverty. Joseph Boakai, his former vice president and now opponent, argues that the country has gone so downhill under his leadership that he is campaigning to rescue Liberia. The two were tied in the mid-40s on the first ballot, with a scheduled runoff in November. Though Liberia's post-Civil War democracy was hailed as a success story since 2006 when its civil war ended, incumbent President George Weah has been accused of creeping authoritarianism, and multiple deadly clashes have taken place between groups of supporters, prompting the UN to urgently call for a peaceful elections process. So, Kelly, what do you make of events in Liberia?
I think we have to recognize that, this region in the last couple of years has unfortunately seen a spike in coups and authoritarian takeovers of democratic countries. And I think we need to keep in mind when we look at Liberia that this is a success story still. It's still only a couple decades ago that they came out of a just brutal civil war. Liberia in the 1990s was not a safe, good place to be. I think it speaks to the desire of people to live in a democracy, the fact that they've been able to come out of that and see a successful democracy for over the past couple decades. And for all intents and purposes, what we've seen, this was a fairly well-run election as well. And, so I think we have to be happy about that. And we'll see what happens with the runoff here in November. But I think for democracy lovers, I think it's been a good thing that we've seen so far out of Liberia. The other big issue, I think, that's the issue of corruption. And corruption was very much on the minds of folks when they voted in this election. And as you noted in your highlights in the beginning, George Weah ran on an anti-corruption campaign when he first won, but hasn't necessarily delivered on that to the extent that people would have wanted him to do that. And so I think that's going to be along with, upholding the rule of law and having free and fair elections. I think that's a big thing to watch for in this, regardless of who wins the election, but are they able to move forward on this anti-corruption campaign in a place like Liberia? If they can, that bodes well for democracy on the whole, not just in the region, but globally. We got another election to talk about though, too, right?
Yes, let's move to Poland. One of my favorite countries in the world, so I'm very excited to talk about it. As listeners may be aware, Poland's ruling right-wing populist Law and Justice Party was just defeated by a coalition of opposition parties led by former Prime Minister Donald Tusk's Civic Coalition. Law and Justice received the most votes, but lost their ability to form a governing majority in the Polish parliament. This ends the party's 8 years in power, during which they clashed with the EU over democratic backsliding and judicial reforms, but they still supported Ukraine staunchly since the Russian invasion and have been a key part of that alliance. Nonetheless, the opposition is expected to form a new government, though the process may take a few months, and it would definitely mark a dramatic political shift in Poland back towards the European mainstream if they can form a government. So, Kelly, to put it mildly, Poland has been a bit of an awkward partner since Law and Justice have been in power. Will we see a return of Poland to the EU fold?
I think so. I hope so. This election victory was a pretty big deal for those of us who are fans of democracy. I think, as you noted, Tusk was the president of the European Council. So it's safe to say you couldn't necessarily see a sharper change in government. And I think they'll be moving forward more on EU projects and trying to further integrate with the EU. But I think the election overall is important for a couple of main reasons, outside of this further integration with the EU. It's a defeat for the illiberal and populist forces in Europe in places like Hungary, Italy, Turkey. Those groups had seemed like they have been on just sort of an onward victory march over the past half decade or decade. And this is, pushing back against that. So that's a big deal. And not only that, but the Polish voters turned out in record numbers, which demonstrates that, this wasn't a fluke that the party won just because nobody turned out and they got lucky. I think the big thing to watch here is just because they won doesn't mean that everything's going to turn around and it's going to be rainbows and butterflies. The real challenge is ahead of this group. And once they form a coalition government, like you said, Law and Justice was in power for 8 years, and they were really able to instill folks into positions of power through state-run media, state-run companies. They've gone through the judiciary and putting in judges that came out of their fold. So overturning a lot of this is going to take some time, and that's going to be interesting to watch. And it's also going to be a signpost for other nations that might hopefully one day vote in less illiberal groups and politicians, because this will provide a playbook on how do you roll back this illiberal state. Big test moving forward here. The second big thing is from a foreign policy standpoint. This new coalition is going to be even more adamantly pro-Ukraine than the previous government, which I think will be a good thing, and give perhaps a needed sort of kick in the rear end. It's well into a year and a half of the war in Ukraine. Any new sort of juice we can get on folks that are pro-Ukraine and a boost to that, I think, is a good thing. So that's definitely going to be the case. And I think you'll see Tusk and Poland be even a little bit more pro-US moving forward, and sort of pro-NATO, because they're rightfully so have a historic and a present fear of Russia. So I think something to watch in the foreign policy realm as well. Speaking of Russia.
Yes, so speaking of Russia, we saw the country lose out on its seat at the UN's Human Rights Council. They have been attempting to regain the seat it lost last year shortly after its invasion of Ukraine, and it came up short, with both regionally allocated seats going instead to Albania and Bulgaria. Kelly, this sounds great. What should we be wary of here in celebrating this?
So you're right. I mean, it is, there's no way on God's green earth that Russia should be allowed on the UN Human Rights Council right now. They were actually kicked off the Human Rights Council a couple months into their invasion of Ukraine. So, on the surface, this is great. They weren't elected back onto the Human Rights Council. But at the same time, I think something that went a little bit under the radar and should be noted as well, though, is that there were 83 countries that voted in favor of bringing Russia back to the UN Human Rights Council. And I think that's something that we've seen over the last year and a half. We've been able to get a lot of votes, condemning Russia, and we've got the West and the United States have been able to get a large pro-Ukraine coalition and sanctions and arms and all these things to Ukraine that gets talked a lot about in the West and in the news. But there's still a large number of countries, and a growing number over the course of the last year and a half, that don't vote or vote for Russia on certain things. And these are sort of the hedging countries throughout the world that see this as more of a European/American Russia conflict that doesn't really necessarily involve them. Some of these countries might still be viewing the West and the United States through a colonial prism from years of colonialism, and still kind of have that in the back of their minds. And others just are more worried about day-to-day things and are just kind of looking for countries that can provide them the things that they need. And they don't really care if Russia's invading Ukraine all that much. So this isn't something, necessarily new, but it's something just to kind of keep on our radar, that there are these countries out there that are hedging and working, both sides, so to speak. They're still talking to Russia, still doing trade and other sorts of deals with Russia, and the U.S. as well. And, this is a longer term issue that the United States is going to have to work on to make sure that we're working with these hedging countries to make sure that they're not necessarily going down the authoritarian path, and going the Russia route.
Yeah, and it's especially surprising to me given that Russia's war in Ukraine is preventing so many of these countries getting the basic grain and food supplies that they often relied upon from Ukraine and to some extent from Russia. That this isn't causing more anger and more consternation in the developing world, but somehow Russia is able to kind of walk that line. I don't know if you have a sense of why that is or why they're able to do that.
Well, again, I think part of it is the fact that there's already sort of an anti-Western bias in some cases here, but also the amount of misinformation, disinformation that is being spewed in around the world, that we don't see as Americans is huge. I mean, we obviously see it as Americans, but in places like Africa, it's got a different tilt. It's aimed at a different audience. They're selling different reasons for the war, and this story or myth coming out of Russia that this is a Western war against Russia, it's a NATO war against Russia. These types of things are getting pushed a lot harder in places like Africa and causing people to sometimes believe that stuff. So a lot of it has to do with the misinformation and disinformation that's being spread, by one of the countries that does it the best, and it's Russia.
Yeah, of course.
All right, folks, that was the first half of our inaugural Headlines in History episode. We're now going to turn to Professor Dan Byman for his perspective on the situation in Gaza and the fighting between Hamas and Israel. Dan Byman is a senior fellow with the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a professor at Georgetown University, where he serves as director of the Security Studies program. He has authored 9 books covering terrorism and hate groups of all stripes, and serves part-time as an advisor to the State Department on its International Security Advisory Board. Dan, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Kelly.
Can you give us a little bit more of a deep dive into the history of Gaza and Israel's role there, and maybe talk a little about why they left in 2005?
Sure. So in 1948, when Israel is created, Gaza is taken over by advancing Egyptian armies. And Gaza remains under Egyptian control until 1967. And very important for Gaza's history, Egypt at the time, and this would be true in later years, is very hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood. So Egypt suppresses any Islamist political activity in Gaza. In the 1967 war, Israel takes control of Gaza. And somewhat ironically, Israel actually gives Islamists a lot more freedom in the Gaza Strip. At the time, Israel is focused on Arab nationalist and communist violence, especially early on in Gaza. And over time, it's more groups like Fatah, which are Arab nationalist. As a result, Islamists have a lot of freedom to put down deep roots in social and educational networks, as well as religious ones, of course, and to, in general, organize themselves. Starting in the 1980s, they begin to prepare for violence. It doesn't go too well initially. And then in 1987, this is a transformative moment, Hamas declares itself, which is a brotherhood organization. And it's seizing on the excitement among Palestinians created by the First Intifada, which breaks out in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And Hamas at the time is relatively weak. And then to go forward several years, Gaza becomes administered by Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority. And this is one of the early episodes of Palestinian self administration. And there's a lot of excitement about this because it's Palestinians ruling over themselves for the first time in their history. And the expectation is that this will be the kernel of an eventual Palestinian state. And in the 1990s, you have terrorism derail peace talks. And a Jewish terrorist murders Yitzhak Rabin, the pro peace Israeli leader who was moving Israel towards peace. And then Arab terrorists, through a series of transportation bombings, sour many Israelis on peace negotiations, which leads to the election of Benjamin Netanyahu for the first time. And he's very skeptical of peace talks. And even though you have continued peace talks and some progress in the 1990s, they drag on and are eventually disrupted by the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000. And this is far more violent. There's really, in some ways, no comparison between the First and Second Intifada. Over 1,000 Israelis die, over 5,000 Palestinians die in this. The level of terrorism is intense. In 2002, there's roughly a suicide bombing a week in Israel. And so it's not the same single event casualties as we saw on October 7th, but it's a steady day in, day out of violence. And this leads many Israelis to conclude they will never have a Palestinian partner. And it's a complex story. There are, in my view, failures on both sides. But the Israeli perception is they'll never have a partner. And the prime minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, wants to align where Jewish borders are, where Israel's borders are, excuse me, with where the Jewish population is. So he is doing very limited withdrawals from the West Bank, but withdrawals from Gaza, where there's really not a significant Jewish settler presence. What I would stress, though, was this withdrawal in 2005, it was unilateral. And this was almost a point of pride among Israelis, where they're saying, we're not negotiating over this. We're just doing it on our own schedule with our own needs. But what that means is the government of the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, it's discredited. It's trying to support negotiations. And Israel's openly saying, over one of the most important things it's doing, it's not even going to bother to negotiate. So Hamas is able to say, look, why did Israel do it? It's because of force. It's because of our attacks on Israel. That's what Israel will listen to. And so this 2005 withdrawal is both a watershed moment in the history of Gaza, but it's also important in the narrative of different Palestinian groups, with Hamas able to claim the violence is more effective than peace negotiations.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Hamas is able to use that then, and then it's just a year later that we see them sort of come to power in Gaza. And they've been the ones that have had political power in Gaza ever since. So, how did they go from telling the story that their violence was what forced out the Israelis to then winning parliamentary elections and taking power in Gaza?
So in 2006, there are elections, and this is something that the administration of President Bush actually pushed on both Israeli and Palestinian leaders. He thought elections would validate the Palestinian leadership, give them legitimacy for negotiations as part of a broader Bush administration effort to promote democracy in the Middle East. What happens instead is that instead of Abbas and the Palestinian Authority gaining legitimacy, they actually lose the election. Now, a lot of this was their own mismanagement. They were so convinced they were going to win that they would do things like they'd run multiple candidates in the same district. So the Hamas candidate might win 40% of the vote, but that's a victory when you're running against three opponents who each win 20%, even if they're from the same party. So Hamas doesn't win a majority of votes, but it wins a majority of seats. There's a dispute over exactly what Hamas's powers are in Gaza versus those of the Palestinian Authority. There's a lot of pressure on Hamas, and Hamas is convinced there's going to be a coup against it, and it seizes power effectively in its own coup in 2007. And it's ruled Gaza ever since. So for 17 years, I think it's reasonable, as we saw on October 7th, to call Hamas a terrorist group. But it's also reasonable to say it's the government of Gaza. It not only does terrorist attacks, and not only does rocket attacks and military operations, but it runs the water system. It has a Department of Motor Vehicles. So all the things you would expect a state to do, Hamas does in a de facto way in Gaza.
Right. And since Hamas took power in Gaza, this isn't the first time that the Israelis and Hamas have fought each other. So, what have been some of the key moments since 2007, 2006? And is there anything we can kind of take away from that as we think about what's coming next?
So we repeatedly saw a back and forth between Israel and Hamas. And what this often involved was Hamas rocket attacks on Israel for some reason. And the reasons varied by the specific historical moment. Sometimes it was a response to Israeli pressure on the West Bank. Sometimes Hamas was trying to send a message about its status in Gaza. And when these attacks happened, Israel would respond harshly, and you would have a back and forth, but it changes in recent years in that Israel develops a very effective system, the Iron Dome system, to shoot down Hamas rockets and missiles. And what that means is one of Hamas's most effective ways of putting pressure on Israel, I wouldn't say seemed to be neutralized, but seemed to be diminished, where it seemed like Hamas had relatively few military options open to it. The other thing I would note was that Israel saw its response as not just going after individual Hamas leaders or those of other groups like Islamic Jihad that are active in Gaza, but also as part of an effort to restore deterrence. So Israel was deliberately hitting hard in order to send a message that if Hamas attacked Israel, Hamas and Gaza, because the two are interwoven, would suffer tremendously, and therefore Hamas should not do the attack in the first place. But as a result, we saw casualty ratios that sometimes were 10 times as high between Palestinians and Israelis, and sometimes 100 times as high. And that's when we're looking at the large numbers of Israeli dead in this last operation, around 1,400 killed at the hands of Hamas. Those ratios are something to consider as we think about the Israeli response.
Yeah, and as of now, there has been no ground incursion yet into Gaza, and there seem to be still negotiations going on for hostages. And there's a couple more. There was two Americans released last week, two elderly Israeli women released. You've spent your career studying terrorism and terror groups, and what do you think we can potentially get out of these negotiations? I mean, Hamas turns over these two, but are they looking at it like it doesn't really matter? We have 200, so we'll release a couple, or like what's the game going on here diplomatically and in negotiation tactics?
So I have to be careful here because the scale of this is well beyond anything I've studied in the past. Usually, when we've talked about hostages, it's been a few individuals, sometimes more. But when you have, one figure I saw yesterday was Israel said it was 222 was their latest count, right? And that's an off the charts number for this conflict. So I would say there are a couple different things Hamas gets out of the hostages. One is that it gets tactical limits on Israel if Israel does go in. Israel has to worry that if it blows up a building, if it goes after a tunnel, that it might not just be targeting Hamas leaders, it might be blowing up its own people. And Hamas has a history of co-locating civilian and military targets, so that's more than plausible. But the bigger issue, and your question is addresses this, is the strategic question, which is how is Hamas going to use these hostages to advance its own ends? And one thing it seems to have done already is to have delayed a ground invasion. From press reporting, the Biden administration, others have been saying to Israel, hold off on a ground invasion until we can get the hostages out. And I think because they're so valuable to Hamas in terms of prisoner exchanges for Hamas prisoners, but also ways to put pressure on Israel, it's highly unlikely Hamas will release large numbers of the hostages. Instead, we're likely to see what we've seen so far, which is a few here, a few there. And that's a way of Hamas saying it's reasonable, that other countries can hold out hope that their people will be released, and that if they just make the right deal, Hamas will do so. Um, and it's a way of extracting concessions from Israel. So I think that the hostages are one of the most complex parts of this already very complex issue.
So before we get you out of here, what are maybe one or two sort of things that you're watching closely as this progresses, whether it be, you already spoke to the negotiation side of things, but is there anything in like the broader diplomacy, like regionally, or something specific with like the actual military incursion itself? What are a couple things that you're watching for?
Let me name two. So, first, there's a question of whether this will become a regional war. And I think there are reasons to think that Hezbollah in Lebanon and other groups will be cautious about making this a regional war. I think there are reasons to think Israel wants to strongly avoid a regional war. But Hezbollah has incentives as well to expand this conflict. And they've already been doing more aggressive attacks, but limited ones, as a way of, I think, showing solidarity with Hamas and as a way of trying to portray themselves as on the side of what has become a very popular group in much of the Arab world. Iran may want to stir the pot as well. And there's a tremendous possibility of miscalculation when you have rockets flying, when you have anti tank weapons being fired, when Israel is bombing Gaza. It's quite plausible one side or the other will hit the wrong thing. One side or the other will calculate that the opponent's going to go after them 100%, so they may as well launch an all out attack. Just a lot of risky possibilities. The other thing I'm watching is the Israeli ground invasion. I do think it's going to happen. To me, it's a question simply of how far will Israel go in and how long will Israel stay. I'm not sure that it'll be a particularly productive invasion in terms of targeting Hamas leadership. I think it enables Hamas to have much of its leadership avoid conflict while some of its fighters go in and harass Israel. but I think there's tremendous political pressure on Israel, on the Israeli government to do so by its own people, given the magnitude of the attack. So this is something I'm watching, and I think will be an event that will have profound consequences for Gaza as well as for Israel.
Right. And they're under pressure from their own populace, as you said, but they're also under pressure from everybody else on the planet to not go in and just completely destroy Gaza and at least go in and try to minimize innocent civilian deaths as much as humanly possible. All right, Professor Dan Byman. Dan, always good to talk to you. It's good seeing you, and I appreciate it very much. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Please join us next week as we return to our regular diplomatic immunity style with our special guest, former acting director of the CIA, Michael Morell. In next week's episode, we'll talk about how America's use of intelligence in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine might be reshaping how we use intelligence as a tool of diplomacy. This episode was produced by Jarrett Dang and Freddie Mallinson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.